afternoon, thank you. I am Lisa Bressman, the Vice Dean. As you know, I have the privilege today of introducing Rebecca Slaughter, who will deliver the Florrie Wilkes Sanders Lecture entitled For Cause on Being an Inconvenient Woman at an Independent Agency, which just might be the best title ever. The lecture today is presented as part of the Dean's Lecture Series by Vanderbilt Law School's Office of Culture and Community, Women Law and Policy Program, Program in Law and Government, George Barrett Social Justice Program, and Women Law students. Rebecca Slaughter was sworn in as a federal trade commissioner on May 2nd, 2018. Before joining the FTC, Ms. Slaughter served as chief counsel to Senator Charles Schumer of New York. She was an associate in the DC office of Sidley and Austin before entering federal service. Ms. Slaughter received her BA magna cum laude from Yale University and her JD from Yale Law School, where she served as an editor of the Yale Law Journal. As you may know, Rebecca Slaughter is also the named plaintiff in Trump versus Slaughter, the case in which the Supreme Court will consider these two questions. First, whether statutory for-cause removal protections for members of multi-member administrative agencies like the FTC violate Article 2 of the Constitution. And second, if such protections are unconstitutional, whether the 1935 case Humphrey's Executor, which upheld the constitutionality of these protections, should be overruled. The court heard oral argument in this case on December 8th, 2025, and a decision is expected before the end of this term. I'll leave the rest of the story to our speaker, who will talk today about being a professional woman in public service and also a named plaintiff, as well as why she cares about agency independence. Time permitting, she will take questions at the end. Please join me in welcoming Rebecca Slaughter.
Hi, it is such an incredible honor and privilege to be here, and particularly to be invited to give a lecture for Women's History Month. I, by instinct, would love to spend this time talking about the incredible women mentors and leaders and inspirational figures in the law that have helped shape my career and the career of men and women that I know in public service. But I've spent a lot of the last year practicing getting comfortable being uncomfortable, and I'm going to practice that skill today by talking a little bit about myself, which is not generally my favorite topic, but I think an important one at this moment in history. So I'm gonna take a step back, go back about a year and a week ago, the week of March 17th, 2025. I had known that the week of March 17th, 2025 was gonna be a big deal week for like the preceding 9 months, because in late spring, early summer of 2024, I had agreed to take on a volunteer leadership role at my elementary school drama club. Drama club at my elementary school, my kids' elementary school, is a very big deal. It is like the culminating thing. And I had a daughter in 5th grade last year, and she is somewhat dramatic by character and chosen hobby. And this was like the culmination of her elementary school experience, this production. And we set the production date back in summer 2024, we set the production date as the end of the week of March 17th. And I'd agreed to take this on, notwithstanding the fact that I had like a full-time job that was pretty time-consuming, because this was like a little bit after the presidential debates happened, and I had a feeling that I was gonna wanna have some joy in my life in early 2025, and something that was a distraction from the world of government and politics that I occupied professionally. So I agreed to take on Drama Club, and it was like a gangbusters success. We had 80 kids between grades 3 and 5 signed up for our production of Beauty and the Beast. And I was not doing the directing or the producing, I was the like logistical operations person, coordinating with parents, making sure kids showed up at the rehearsals, that like goldfish packets were opened appropriately and that the crumbs were cleaned up. like the high stakes, the most high stakes work. My daughter, my 5th grade daughter, was cast as Belle in this performance. So it's a even bigger deal than I had anticipated at the beginning. So I found myself on Tuesday, March 18th. I worked a full day at the FTC. I was meeting with staff from several of the different divisions in the agency, which I tried to do once a year, every year during my FTC tenure, in what I called check-in meetings, just where I heard from staff, not about any particular matter or any particular issue, but just tried to be open to what's on their mind. How could I answer questions? Those meetings were really hard in early 2025. The staff were very anxious. They were very sad about the destruction that was being wrought across the federal government. And they had a lot of questions that I couldn't answer for them, and I didn't have the answers. But I thought it was still important to have the conversation. So I did a bunch of those meetings and then hustled back to Bethesda and was sitting outside the elementary school gym in the dusty, those painted brick hallways. The kids are dressed up as forks and spoons and singing Be My Guest, and we're like in it in rehearsal. I blocked out all of those afternoons from my schedule, and I got a text message from my assistant who had access to my inbox saying, I really think you should check your email. I know you're a drama club and we're trying to block this off, but I think you should look at your work email. And I opened my email knowing that this was not likely to be good news, and found an email from someone in the presidential personnel office that was very long, but basically said, you're fired. Said specifically something like, your continued service at the FTC is incompatible with President Trump's priorities, so you're removed effective immediately. And I called my colleague Alvaro Bedoya, the other Democratic commissioner at the FTC, and found out that he actually also had not been looking at his email because he was at a kid thing after work. And I told him he might check his email, and he had the same email. So we sort of took a deep breath and figured out, okay, we're in it. If my life were one of the, were a movie or one of the Disney, formulaic Disney sitcoms that my kids watch religiously with the laugh tracks, even though I find them extremely painful to watch, this is the point where the main character would break the fourth wall, turn to the audience and say, you may be wondering how I got here, in a dusty elementary school gymnasium hallway with an email from the President of the United States purporting to fire me. And in fact, I was wondering how I got here. No part of that scenario was how I envisioned my life or my career. I didn't ever imagine myself to have, I grew up in Manhattan. And I found myself living in the suburbs with 4 kids, driving a minivan, attending public school, working in this drama club production. And I never imagined having a Senate-confirmed job of any variety, much less one that put me in the crosshairs of a constitutional crisis. So I thought I'd take a moment and back up and tell you how did I get there? How exactly did that happen? I always knew that I wanted a career in public service. That part was not a surprise. I did not want to have a very public-facing career in public service. If I hadn't gone to law school, my alternative career paths were being a preschool teacher or being a professional stage manager, because I really liked the behind-the-scenes operational orchestration of things. But I also really loved the law, and I loved public policy. So I went to law school thinking I wanted to work in public policy, and I ended up working in the Senate. I actually took a year off from law school to work in the Senate, and then went back to law school, graduated, went to a law firm thinking I wanted to pay off my debt, which was very real and extensive. But after I'd been at the law firm for about 9 months, I was invited back to Senator Schumer's office in a counsel role, and I took it. Although before I took it, I said, what kind of work, what would my portfolio be? Because if you work in Congress, you have a particular issue area portfolio. And I was like, I want to do really exciting, high stakes stuff like national security. And I was really interested in criminal law and policy. I said, I really just don't want to do boring stuff like telecom, tech policy, antitrust, like privacy. I don't want to do that stuff. And I was told, oh, no, it's fine. Chuck Schumer likes you. He'll put you on whatever is interesting. I said, okay. And I showed up, and the first thing I was assigned to was the massive patent reform bill that was passed in 2009. And for law students, I want to just tell you, things I did not take in law school include intellectual property law, antitrust law, consumer protection law, data privacy, or admin law. I didn't take any of those things. And those have been the things that I have built my career around. I wish I had taken them. Might have made some things easier, but I think it's important to remember that you don't have to define your entire career when you're in law school by what you take. I think it's really important to do things that you think are interesting and then to be open to learning new things. And so that's what I did. I got to the Senate, I learned a lot of new things. I actually loved IP. I loved it. I loved antitrust. I loved the consumer protection, the tech policy, the data privacy work. Part of why I loved it was that it was work that was basically more parochial than partisan. You could find ways to work with people across the aisle because the issues themselves didn't necessarily lend themselves to sort of dramatic partisan fights. And I found that really interesting. I also thought it was an important way. Those are issues that really matter to people in their everyday lives, even if they're not as headline grabbing as some of the sort of high profile, hot button cultural issues. So as I stayed in Senator Schumer's office and got promoted, I ended up reallocating I had the opportunity to reallocate portfolios among the lawyers who worked for me, and I kept all that civil legal stuff that I thought would be so boring. And I gave away, the immigration and crime and civil rights and civil liberties issues. I also did not expect that I would end up having kids while I worked in the Senate. When I got pregnant with my oldest in 2012, there was one person at my level of seniority or above who had had one woman, to be clear, one woman at my level of seniority or above who had had a baby while working for Senator Schumer. There were people who had had kids way before they got there, people who left to have kids, but not a lot of people who stayed and worked because it was an incredibly time-consuming job that involved enormous amounts of late nights at the office. Like the routine in those days was, you'd work all day with meetings, and then at 5 o'clock, we'd start what we called staff time, where Senator Schumer met with his staff to talk about whatever had happened during the day, and you just sat there from 5 to 10 most nights until he was ready to talk to your particular team. Not especially conducive to working parents. The one person I mentioned who had had a woman who'd had a baby before me was his deputy chief of staff, and her baby was born 2 months before my baby. So we basically had to figure it out together. How are we gonna get through this process? And I thought, I love this job and I don't wanna leave, so I wanna see if I can make it work. And I did, and he did. Senator Schumer did, his chief of staff did. They were really committed to finding a way to make us able to stay, even with small kids. So I stayed, and then also, and credit him, when I got pregnant with my second, I was promoted to be Senator Schumer's chief counsel 10 days before my second was born, which means that I got a maternity leave, which, by the way, the Senate was not statutorily required to give, paid out at a higher increased salary, which they did not have to do. And that bought an enormous amount of loyalty and commitment from me, and so I kept staying. And then in 2018, or 2017, I guess, I got pregnant with my third. And at that point, Senator Schumer was the minority leader. President Trump had been elected. And it was very hard. That was a very hard time to be working in the Senate at all. In my job in particular, I worked on Supreme Court nominations, I worked on the Mueller investigation, I worked on a lot of stuff that was not bipartisan civil legal opportunities for consensus. It was very hard. And I did not think I was going to be able to sustain that pace with a third baby at home. And I got very lucky. I had a very much like right place, right time, right moment situation because the Democrats needed to find a candidate to be an FTC commissioner. There was a vacancy, and they needed somebody who would be, who President Trump was willing to nominate, who a Republican Senate would be willing to confirm, and who would be acceptable to the Democratic caucus. That was sort of an elusive thing, and I happen to fit in that bill, so Senator Schumer recommended me for the FTC slot. My nomination was announced, I think, on March 26th, 2018. I delivered my third baby on April 2nd, 2018, and I had my confirmation hearing on April 11th, 2018, with a 9-day-old baby. That was how badly I wanted that job. Like, I didn't have to, nobody was gonna force me to do it. They said, you don't have to do this now, but we want to, there are other pending FTC nominations. We want to move these nominations, and if you want to be in that package, you have to have the confirmation hearing. And I knew enough about the politics of nominations and confirmations to know that if I didn't go in that package, it was going to be a very long time. And I figured I'd rather do the confirmation hearing 9 days postpartum than not do it. So that was like, you know, I tell those stories because I think it's important to know that life happens at inconvenient times, and you can't really plan around that. So I found myself at the FTC. I loved working at the FTC. I joined as a minority commissioner. I served as the acting chair at the beginning of the Biden administration. Actually, I'll back up. Before that, I got pregnant with my fourth child when I was a minority commissioner at the FTC. And I had to figure out, okay, what do you do when you're a commissioner and you have a baby? How does this work? The answer is nobody knows, because it had never happened before I had my baby. I was the first sitting commissioner that we could find at any federal board or commission to have a baby while in office. And the reason this is relevant is that commissioners have a different statutory job structure than traditional federal employees. Commissioners are 24/7 employees. You don't get vacation time, you don't get sick time, you don't get maternity leave. You can do whatever you want, but you don't have that kind of structure, so there was no practice and there was no precedent. And you know, when I asked the general counsel's office at the FTC what I should do, they said, you know, well, you're a 24/7 employee. If you take a maternity leave, Donald Trump could fire you for cause. That's kind of ironic. And at the time I said, okay, you know what, that is not gonna be a motivating factor for me. If he wants to pick a fight by firing a pregnant woman or a new mother for taking time to be with her baby, okay, bring that on. I actually thought, though, I felt a real obligation to my job, and I thought, oh, I should just get back to work right away. And my staff actually said no. They said, that is terrible leadership. You cannot send the message to the employees at this agency that they should turn around and show up right back at the office when they have a baby. You need to model the thing that you want them to be able to do in their lives. And so I thought that was actually really good advice, and decided to take basically a modified but real maternity leave where I made myself available to vote on things where my vote would be important, and just passed on basically everything else. And it worked out pretty well. Okay, so then 2020 election happens, 2021 starts. We are deep in the pandemic, right? So I have 4 kids at home. They're not going to school, which was not part of the game plan when I got pregnant with the 4th child. I assumed that the other children would get to go to school. We were all working from home. I was the acting chair of the agency, and then when Lena Khan was confirmed and she was made the chair of the agency, I went back to being a majority commissioner, which I think I've done all the jobs. I think that was the best job, majority commissioner, and more aligned with my personal style and interest. And I really grew over that time to love the agency, appreciate the structure of the agency, care deeply about the work of the agency. My first term expired in 2022, I think, in late 2022, and President Biden renominated me for another term, and I was confirmed to that in a package unanimously with Andrew Ferguson and Melissa Holyoke as Republican commissioners in March of 2024 for a term that ends in September 2029. So here I was committed to serving out this whole term, and the transition, the 2024 election happened. We transitioned to the new administration. Andrew Ferguson, who had been a commissioner, became the chair of the agency. And I flipped back into minority commissioner mode, which I knew how to do, and thought was an important and valuable role where you get to sort of find things, try to find areas of consensus, and feel free to disagree publicly when you don't. But here I was now in a gym, fired. So Alvaro and I, this wasn't a total surprise to us. I think the way I would put it is that it was shocking, but not surprising. As I think you know, the language of the FTC Act is very clear that commissioners can only be removed for neglect, inefficiency, or malfeasance in office, so collectively for cause. That statute was passed in 1914, was challenged one time by President Roosevelt, and unanimously upheld by the Supreme Court in 1935 as a constitutionally valid structure for an agency, and has been replicated in about 24 other agencies, including the Fed, almost all the financial regulators, SEC, CFTC, FDIC, the telecom regulators. Some of those statutes do not explicitly have for-cause removal provisions. Some of them do. The structures are slightly different in terms of the tenure of the commissioners and whether they can continue serving post-expiration of terms. But the general structure, multi-member, bipartisan, staggered terms with either implicit or explicit for-cause removal protections has been really foundational for our government for a very long time, for over 100 years, explicitly in statute, and really with evidence dating back to the founding from the sinking fund and other issues. So one might say well-rooted in custom and tradition. So we had to figure out, what are we going to do? From the courtyard of the elementary school, which I ducked into, I released a statement that said many things, but the top of it said, I woke up this morning, as I have every day for nearly the last 7 years, eager to get to work on behalf of the American people to make the economy more honest and fair. But today, the president illegally fired me from my position as a federal trade commissioner, violating the plain language of a statute and clear Supreme Court precedent. Why? Because I have a voice, and he is afraid of what I'll tell the American people. So why? Why am I in this fight? Why did I decide that I want to push back on what the president was doing? And I think it's important to talk a little bit about why I think this fight matters, and then I'll talk a little bit about the litigation. I think it matters both in principle and in practice. The principles that I care very much about are, first of all, the rule of law and standing up for it. If the president disagrees with this idea of for-cause removal protections at independent agencies, there's a way to fix that is set forth in the Constitution. Bicameralism, presentment, have a legislative debate, change the law. There's no requirement that these agencies be independent. They are independent because Congress structured them that way, and Congress delegated to them specific powers with an understanding that their leadership would have a degree of remove from political interference. Not would be entirely free of executive influence, but a degree of remove. And I think, pretty fundamentally, that as an attorney, and importantly as a person who took an oath to the Constitution, that I have an obligation to fight for that structural Article 1 versus Article 2 balance of power to be upheld. I also knew that I was in a unique position to push back vis-a-vis some other people who were either on the receiving end or witness to actions they thought were unfair or difficult. When I talked to the FTC staff, when I had all those difficult conversations with them early in 2025, they asked me a lot of questions about like, well, I don't feel comfortable. If I don't feel comfortable with something that the agency is doing, but like I gotta put food on my family's table, how do I balance that? That's a really incredibly real question that people ask themselves and have to deal with. And what I told them, and I continue to believe, is there is nothing wrong with prioritizing your family. Like, you have to take care of yourself and your family. There are people who worry about their immigration status. There are people who worry about their kids' access to health care. I'm very sympathetic to those people saying, I'm not the right person to fight this fight right now. That is not the right way for me to balance those obligations. And I was not in that position. My husband had a stable private sector job. My kids were all in public school. We could afford to live without my salary for a little while, and in a position of incredible privilege. I was not worried about my immigration status or my kids' access to healthcare or all of those other things. And I had an incredible network of support in both my micro family unit, my husband, my kids, my parents, my friends, and more broadly in the community. And I really deeply believe that if you are in a position with that kind of privilege, you also have an obligation to use it. Not everybody is, but if you are, I think you should. And then the practical reason that I care about it is I care very much about what independent agencies do for our country and why they are important and valid constitutional structures. So I'll talk a little bit about what that means. If you want to think about the legal arguments, the conclusive and preclusive executive power, you can read all of the truly excellent briefing in my Supreme Court case. It's a good, interesting legal argument of which I think my attorneys have the much better side. But I actually just want to focus on what does it mean in practice? Because I lived it for 7 years. What does it mean at the FTC to be bipartisan, multi-member? How does it affect what decisions get made, how they get made, and how the public understands them? So I think the first really important thing that independence does is provide a check on corruption. And that's not a small issue. I'll give you a particular example from my own experience. When a year after I got to the FTC, we settled this massive case with Facebook over a violation of a privacy consent decree, and the FTC got a $5 billion settlement from Facebook. It was unprecedented, still has not been replicated in terms of its scope and scale and volume. Objectively, a huge sum of money, an unfathomable sum of money to me, Becca. Just could not put my head around it. But not to Facebook. And I dissented, and my fellow Democratic commissioner at the time, Commissioner Chopra, dissented from the settlement because we thought it really was not going to be effective to discipline Facebook's behavior in the market. And we thought that meant it not the right outcome in that particular case. We did not think it was the product of political pressure from the White House or done because Facebook was a big donor to the president. At the time, it was not. And had we thought those things, we would have said it in our dissent. And so when the public read our dissents, they could say, okay, I don't know, I can make a decision about which side has the better argument in terms of whether this is a great use of government resources or ineffective, and reasonable minds can in fact disagree about that. But they didn't think, oh, I don't know, like we're sort of politically corrupt, moneyed influence pulling strings here. Contrast that with this fall when the FTC settled a case that we brought under Chair Khan's tenure against Amazon for illegal subscription traps, basically trapping people into Prime subscriptions through a process that they called the Iliad, was how they internally described the subscription trap model. The FTC settled it for like $3.5 billion, I think, in fall of 2025, so after Commissioner Bedoya and I had been removed. Did they ink that settlement on the eve of trial, right after the FTC had won basically all the pretrial motions and was in incredibly good position to get a liability finding? Did they do it because it was the best result for consumers and the most efficient outcome? Maybe. Did they do it because Amazon had donated to the president's inauguration, to the ballroom destruction and reconstruction, had paid $40 million for the Melania documentary? Maybe. And I don't know, because I wasn't inside the building able to talk to staff on the case and look at the documents and understand. And the public doesn't know either. And without having independent commissioners at these agencies who are able to provide that transparency and accountability as a check against corruption, it really undermines the integrity of all of the decision-making of the agency. Okay, so that's the corruption side. In normal times, when rank corruption is not on the table and not a thing that we're thinking about, there are still enormous benefits. The first thing that the multi-member structure does is incentivize a drive towards consensus. When you have a bipartisan commission structure, the majority can do whatever it wants. Minority commissioners cannot, by fiat, undermine the will of the majority. But if you're in the majority, you know it is better to get consensus-driven decisions if you want them to have credibility in the courts and durability and stability in terms of the outcomes than it is to do party line votes. And that is why the vast bulk of the FTC decisions, even in contentious times, ended up being bipartisan because majority leadership worked to get minority support. I'll give you a couple of concrete examples. When I was the acting chair, the commission voted out a merger challenge in a case called Illumina Grail. This was a vertical merger involving a DNA sequencing company and an absolute monopoly. But vertical mergers are generally very contentious and hard to challenge. And when I was the acting chair, the commission was divided 2-2. And I got all 4 commissioners unanimous support for the challenge to the merger. And then when it eventually came back around on commission appeal, when Chair Khan was in charge, she managed to get all 4 sitting commissioners at the time, it was 3 Democrats and 1 Republican, to support a finding that the merger was illegal. That finding got challenged in the Fifth Circuit. And if Chair Khan had not effectively gotten Commissioner Wilson, the Republican support for that, I think the challenge in the Fifth Circuit would have been much more likely to be successful by the merging parties because they would have been fueled by Commissioner Wilson's dissent that would have laid out her opposition to whatever it was. So that took work, and it provided, and the Fifth Circuit ultimately upheld the FTC's position, which, by the way, the Fifth Circuit does not do. Like, you read the news of the last week, the Fifth Circuit struck down 2 different FTC things. So that was a really, really big deal. So it creates durability, stability in decision-making. And when that consensus is not available, it provides transparency and accountability in the markets, even putting aside the corruption point I made earlier, just about what the law provides and what options look like. And among the people who have subscribed to the benefits of having that transparency and accountability is Chair Ferguson, who talked on a podcast the week before I got fired about his thousands of pages of dissents that he wrote in the 9 months that he was a minority commissioner and how they were valuable for market participants and policymakers to think about what alternative counterfactual resolutions of particular matters could be. So that experience, that lived practical reality of independent agency decision-making, I found to have enormous, enormous benefit that deserves protection. So here I was, found myself, okay, I'm going to fight for this. What did that look like in practice? I was a practicing lawyer for 9 months before I went into public policy, so I barely had clients. I definitely never was a client before. It was a really weird, surreal experience. At the very beginning, a lot of what I did was talking to the press, which is not my area of comfort, but I felt very strongly that people needed to care about this case, and they weren't going to care organically because there were so many things going on. So I had an obligation. If I was going to be in the litigation, I wanted to get out there and explain to people why it mattered and why they should care, why it matters for working people to have agencies that are not balanced and independent, protecting the integrity of economic markets, and instead just further arms of the president, contrary to the congressional design. One of my kids said to me in this period of time, a month or 2 after I got fired, Mommy, I really thought that getting fired meant you'd have more time to spend with us. Like, why are you so busy all the time? Which was fair enough. That died down a little bit. I needed a project, so I ran a marathon. I really wanted to pour myself into something that was healthy and not sitting in my basement feeling sad and anxious. It was a very good project. It was extremely hard. Marathons are very hard. And that was part of why I did it, because I knew it was hard. And I wanted to have this sort of lived metaphor for myself of I can do hard things that take a long time, and I'm not sure. I don't know if I'm gonna cross the finish line of the New York City Marathon. I don't know how this case is gonna end, but I know there's value in doing it, and I know there's value in trying. And that was very helpful to me to have as a motivating, disciplining, get out of the house every day project. The district court where we filed heard summary judgment, our oral argument in our case in May. In June, Commissioner Bedoya, who did not have the same structural privileges that I had in terms of a spouse working in the private sector with enough money to pay for their life, decided he needed to actually get another job, a very reasonable 99% approach. And because he did that, the district court ordered sua sponte briefing on whether he would continue to have standing in the case. That took like another month, and in July, the district court issued a decision saying that our firing was illegal. Commissioner Bedoya didn't have standing to challenge it, but I did. That was on a Thursday night, and on Friday morning, I walked back into the office. The staff actually organized a clap-in for me, which was incredibly moving and really, really meant a lot. It was a short-lived celebratory moment. Monday of that week, of the next week, the whole agency building was closed for some maintenance issues, so I worked from home, but I hadn't even gotten a computer. They couldn't get me a computer yet, so worked from home from a phone. And then Monday night, the DC Circuit issued an administrative stay, so I was back out. Then life proceeded through August, the day after Labor Day. In September, the DC Circuit vacated the stay that they had issued and issued a pretty lengthy decision, but procedural on the stay, reinstating me again. So that was a Tuesday night. I was at ice cream with my kids celebrating getting back to school. My husband was on a plane to Abu Dhabi, and my phone started blowing up as we're walking into the ice cream parlor. And my kids were like, "Don't you have to answer that?" And I was like, "No, I don't even have a job. We're getting ice cream. It's fine." This is the priority right now. And then I got back to the car and I was like, "Oh, actually, apparently I do have a job." So I got to go answer the phone, and I figured out how to be back in the office the next day. Again, first thing in the morning, which, it's not a particular, you don't have to feel sorry for me, but that kind of rearranging your life on a dime with no notice takes a little bit of dexterity and a lot of support. I really had to call on a lot of friends and family and flexibility and patience from my children to make that happen. A slightly longer duration that time around, and I made it through Monday, midday, when the Supreme Court issued an administrative stay again and requested briefing on the government's emergency stay application. So I was in the office Monday morning, had some meetings with agency staff, and then was actually on my way out to a pre-planned interview when the decision came down. So I went to the interview, and then I went home and picked my elementary school kids up from the bus. When they got out of the bus, my kindergartner, so she's on week 1 of school, says, "Mommy, what are you doing here? I thought you had to be at work. Did you get fired again?" And I said, "Pretty much, yeah." And she goes, "Hooray, Mommy got fired." I was like, "It's not really a hooray moment." She goes, "Well, I'm happy that you're here." And I said, "Well, we can feel 2 feelings at the same time on this one. We practice that a lot in our house." A couple weeks later, the Supreme Court, full court, issued a stay and simultaneously granted cert before judgment. So then we're in this Supreme Court litigation. At that moment, I did not feel very good. I was not enjoying this experience. I missed my job. I missed my agency. I missed predictability and stability in my life. I basically had 2 jobs. I don't like change very much. I don't like disruption. I didn't like the public attention. I didn't like, a lot of people would say to me, like, oh, you're going to be the next Humphreys executor. I'm like, how's it going to feel to have your name on a terrible Supreme Court decision? Not good. Like, that's not fun. So I thought a little bit about, like, oh, do I really have to do this? Like, oh, I don't want to do this. Kind of like I feel, actually, before I go for my run every morning. Like, I don't want to do this. And I let myself play out that question. Like, no, actually, you don't have to do this, Becca. Nobody is forcing you to do this. You could walk away at any moment. It is your choice. So then I did the thought exercise. How would it feel to walk away? I can. What would that be like? And I thought about it. I was like, actually, that would feel so much worse. Kind of like not going for the run, but on a larger scale, because I didn't like the experience, but I felt very good being able to tell my children and my friends and strangers that I was fighting for a principle that I believed in. And I was doing it because I had the privilege to do it, but also because I cared about doing it. And that felt so much better than the thought of how I would feel after the immediate relief wore off of walking away and not doing it. And that was helpful. That was really helpful to get into. So then I went to the Supreme Court. That was weird. I think I'd been in the Supreme Court maybe like one time in my life before for a tour. And I found myself sitting for oral argument there. Sitting next to me on the one side were my husband and Alvaro. And by the way, if you are a named plaintiff in the Supreme Court, you just sit in the public seats. There's not a special seat for those people. On the other side of me were Gwen Wilcox and Kathy Harris, who were the named plaintiffs in their own challenges to their illegal removals at the NLRB and the MSPB, respectively. Which was really important. It was a great example of how this weird club of people who have been in these statutorily protected positions have really showed up for each other, even though there's a universe where our incentives could be misaligned, right? Because you could imagine each of us trying to argue that our case is different from the other cases, and so protect me, but not her, and that's very much not what has happened. Also, women who are quietly and determinedly fighting for the thing that they believe in and agencies that they serve and care about in order to carry out the oaths that they took, which they take very seriously. Someone once said to me, do you have a group chat of all the people who've been illegally fired? And I said, no, because that would be thousands of people. It would be very unwieldy. I was like, if we did, though, we would only use it to discuss war plans, which... Thank you. Thank you for the niche DC politics joke response. So we got through the argument, and now we're waiting for the decision. And I don't know what's going to happen in this litigation. I could lose. That's obviously on the table. I am very confident, though, that I am on the right side of history. And I would much rather be on the right side of history than on the winning side of any particular case. In darker moments in the fall, I would occasionally Google bad Supreme Court cases just to remind myself how many of them there have been over the course of our country's history, and none of them ended the conversation about whatever was their topic, right? Plessy v. Ferguson didn't end the conversation. And I am not comparing myself to racial segregation, discrimination questions, but that's just one example. I mean, Roe didn't end the conversation for people who opposed abortion. There are public policy issues that continue to be the topic of discussion and import even after a Supreme Court decision, and that's what I continue to care about. Fighting for the rule of law, for checks and balances, and for a government that is accountable to the people of the United States and not to the oligarchy is something that is not going to stop being important to me, whatever happens in this case and whatever that looks like in particular. And in the meantime, I get to pick up my kids at the bus more, which is really nice for me and for them most of the time. So with that, I will wrap up and take any questions that you guys have, and please do not be shy about asking. I think we have a couple mics planted. Julia has one, and Natalia has the other. So feel free to raise it. I saw one hand go up right here right away.
Hi, thank you so much for speaking with us. I was wondering, you mentioned that the other commissioner lost standing when he got a job, and I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit more about, do you have to remain unemployed during this entire process in order to keep your case alive?
Yes. So on the one hand, it's a difficult question to answer because there's not a lot of jurisprudence or precedent around this. The conclusion I came to with my attorneys is basically yes, because if I were to win, my litigating position is not that I want to be reinstated. I say that, but that's actually not what we're legally arguing. What we are legally arguing is that the removal was illegal and therefore invalid, and that I am still an FTC commissioner. And as an FTC commissioner, I can't have another job at all. And if I got one, that could implicate ethics issues. It could create complicated recusal questions. And so it's the kind of thing where there's not a lot of roadmap for how to do it, but that is the conclusion that we have come to.
Hi, thank you so much for coming. You've come to one of the schools that has regulatory state as a mandatory 1L class. So I think probably
Congratulations, you're 10 steps ahead of me.
So sort of on that question, something that struck me when we started Reg State is how little knowledge there actually is in the public about that topic. You know, you're always hearing about the president, Congress, the court, but not as much about our agencies. So as you've sort of faced with the media and kind of bringing public attention to your cause, what has been the experience with a populace that might not know as much about the regulatory state and what their duty is?
So I think about it a little bit. Okay, I'm going to answer that question in a couple different ways. I actually think a lot of government, again, going back to wanting to be a stage manager, it's a little bit like stage managers. If it's working well, people don't know about it. Like, please also see our airports right now, right? Like, you don't really think about, I mean, you know you have to go through security, but you don't think about that infrastructure until it breaks and it's in really dire straits. And so I think part of the job, it's not just independent agencies, but generally helping people understand the things that government does for them to help make them not have to think about government is an important job to play, and it involves just being very public and transparent about it. In terms of independent agencies in particular, I have now had occasion to give a lot of thought to how and why Congress has set up some agencies as independent as opposed to directly under the executive branch control. And I want to be clear that when I say independent, I actually do not subscribe to the idea that these are unelected, bureaucratic, like Wild Wests. I actually think there's an enormous amount of presidential control over independent agencies. The president nominates commissioners and can remove them for cause. Budgets are set by Congress. The agencies are accountable to congressional oversight. There are lots of different ways these agencies can interact, but the ones that Congress designed to be multi-member, bipartisan, it's a huge group of agencies that deal with economic integrity. I don't think that that's accidental. And then there's a separate set that I think deal a little bit more with oversight of the federal government itself. So I'm thinking a little bit more like the MSPB, the Merit Systems Protection Board that Kathy Harris served on, the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board, the Office of Special Counsel that Hampton Dellinger was in, but not multi-member. And I think those structures are also about how do you ensure transparency and accountability in government decision-making. I forgot the most important way presidents control these agencies. They pick the chair, and the chair statutorily sets like the entire agenda for the agency and controls the staffing and the budget allocation and all this stuff. So that's a huge amount of presidential control. But where did Congress want to put a check on absolute presidential control? The same way Congress set up other statutory limitations in traditional executive branch agencies. It's over these agencies that deal with economic integrity. And that does not feel like an accident for me, and it's something that we have to take very seriously. So trying to explain that to real people, like why does it matter if you get, death by 1,000 subscription traps? Why does it matter if the healthcare merger has raised the costs of your access to medicine or your ability to even have a hospital to visit? And talking about that, I think, is just an important part of government service, even if it's not my favorite part. We're here.
Hi, thank you so much for coming to speak with us today. I really was curious about everything that you said today. I have no background in this and taking Reg State now, so it's fascinating. You described a lot of the support you got from your family, your friends, and some of your coworkers, especially when you came back in. I'm curious to hear about your experiences with your coworkers who are across the aisle and how they reacted to this whole saga and like what that relationship is like in the context of the kind of, bipartisan setup of the agency.
Yeah, it's a very good question and a hard one to answer. One of the things I've loved and worked hard on at the FTC, and honestly when I was working on the Hill, was forging good working relationships with people with whom I disagreed about almost everything. Christine Wilson, who is one of the Republican commissioners on the FTC during the time that I served, I really just think she's wrong about basically 100% of her legal views, with a small subset exception to where we have some common ground on privacy issues. And she really hated Chair Khan, and she quit the FTC in a fiery Wall Street Journal op-ed that accused us all of being horrible, lying socialists. And she remains a really good friend. We had lunch a couple weeks ago. She threw a Zoom tea party for one of my daughters during COVID when my second kid, who was in kindergarten, was like obsessed with having Zoom meetings because that's how she went to school, which, guys, that was rough times. You all lived it too. And Ellie really wanted to have a Zoom meeting where she could control who was muted and who could go into breakout rooms. And Christine threw her Zoom tea party, invited a whole bunch of agency staff, sent petty fours to our house so we could eat these tea things. And that kind of relationship was really valuable and really important, remains really valuable and really important to me. And I had those good working relationships with the Republicans at the FTC at the time I got fired. When I filed suit, the suit is currently captioned Trump v. Slaughter. The full caption is Donald Trump, Andrew Ferguson, Melissa Holyoke, and David Robbins, the executive director of the agency. Awkward to have the same kind of friendship when you are in active litigation against somebody. That's my most generous interpretation. I also think, they are working for a president who has demonstrated himself to be incredibly vindictive and uninterested in bipartisan collaborative relationships. So if I were those Republican commissioners, I would not think my job security was well protected, at all, because, by the way, by firing the Democrats, what the president said is, I will fire you too, Republicans, if you don't do what I want. So I wouldn't think it was protected at all, and I would certainly not think it would be well protected if I maintained an ongoing social or cordial relationship across the aisle. And I think that that's really sad. Oh, two more, and I saw you over there. Oh, that was good spotting, Natalia.
Hi, thank you for being here. So hopefully we will see an end to the Trump administration eventually. And if Humphreys is overturned, what do you see that looking like in a new administration that hopefully respects the law?
So I think it's actually very hard to talk specifically about what it means without seeing what the decision looks like. It's almost impossible to forecast without knowing breadth, scope, contours, mechanisms. I will say something that I have found a little bit perplexing is how this has lined up in a sort of partisan way, because I do not think Humphreys is a partisan decision that protects partisan interests. I will remind you that Commissioner Humphrey was an extremely conservative Republican commissioner who was fired because he was interrupting FDR's use of the FTC to implement the New Deal. He didn't like the socialist New Deal, so he was fired for being the pro-business, anti-government commissioner, and the precedent protects that interest, continued presence in government. And so I found it very mystifying that like the Chamber of Commerce filed an amicus brief on the side of the president in my case, because I do not think the Chamber of Commerce will be very excited when it's like President AOC using all of these agencies to implement her agenda without any transparency and accountability provided by minority commissioners. So that's not really an answer to your question. It's just an observation that I think there is a long-term interest in the kinds of things that independence provides that should transcend party. It's a little bit more like institutionalist versus more transformative, radical perspectives on government on both sides. And I hear a lot from businesses about how they really want stability and predictability out of government, and I don't know how they see this giving that to them. There's a question over here.
This is a comment, not a question, so thanks for being here. I just wanted to say, since you're here for Women's History Month, it's really inspiring to hear you balance your job with being a mom. I think the narrative, especially for those of us in the legal field, is that you kind of have to pick one, or if you do both, you can't give 100% to both. So hearing you really elegantly blend the fact that you're phenomenal at your job and phenomenal at being a mom, it sounds like, is just really refreshing to hear and wonderful to hear. So I appreciate you incorporating that in your keynote speech and talking about the maternal leave issues as well, and like all of that. It's really great to hear. So thank you.
I appreciate that comment, but I will push back a little bit. I do think it is true that you can't give 100% to both. You don't have 200% of self. Nobody does. And by the way, you also have to save some slice for yourself if you are going to be able to deliver in any other area of your life. I think the thing that I have been able to do really well and that I would encourage other people to do is give myself permission to do things imperfectly, because I still like doing both the things imperfectly more than I would like doing only one or only the other, and not spending my time beating myself up about what an absolute disaster zone my house is, and certainly my car right now, or how I can't do like, some of the networking or meetings in the afternoon hours that I would like to do. And I just don't get mad at myself about that, because I am able to have a very fulfilling life and career without doing those things perfectly. And I think for law students in particular, you are, for the most part, probably type A, high achieving, hardworking people who are used to doing everything you do really, really well, and learning that it is better to do it as well as you can, even if that's not perfect, than to not do it at all is, I think, a really important growth area. And figuring out how to support each other, your partners, particularly men, supporting men also balancing things and not having it be entirely on women is a really important part of the job too. So part of why I like to talk about this stuff is it wasn't easy and I had to figure out how to do it. And it's still hard, but I'm I'd rather be doing both of them hard than giving up one or the other.
Perfect place to end.
Thank you.